Right, so whilst the dust hasn't actually had time to settle in Syria following the ousting of Bashar al-Assad and his government by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, formerly known as Syria's wing of Al-Qaeda, that hasn't stopped politicians and mainstream media voices hailing this as a great victory for peace and justice, almost conveniently ignoring that fact that HTS were, not so long ago, very much seen as the enemy, yet are now being lionised, because Western interests, both military and economic, have been met, as well as Israel having had a massive favour done for them, the splitting up of the axis of resistance and isolation of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Lebanon now surrounded. 500,000 Lebanese fled to Syria when Israel invaded. They will be tomorrow's small boats refugees, I expect. This is precisely how refugees are created, after all. Where independent voices have been arrested and attempts to silence them have been made for pointing out the terrorism of Israel, it is perfectly fine for mainstream media to not only ignore the track record of actual terrorists themselves, but hold them up as heroes now for deposing Assad. As much as you can dislike Assad's regime, if you're not seeing the double standard here of the Terrorism Act being abused to silence those holding power to account, but giving those who are in it with them a free pass, then you need to watch this and realise what is happening here and who these mainstream media idiots are cheerleading for. Right, so Assad has gone. There's been a lot of Assad bashing, and I've certainly joined in with that. He was not a good leader. He did lead an oppressive regime, and therefore his political demise, having now fled to Russia as he has, is certainly not something to cry about and lose sleep over. But it has also allowed mainstream media voices and politicians to position themselves and the terrorist group that had deposed him as heroes and liberators. They are absolutely nothing of the kind. Since when was it right or appropriate to rehabilitate Al-Qaeda, for God's sake? Slamming Assad is entirely legitimate, but he is also now the past. He's history. What matters now for Syria is what happens there today and going forwards under the new rule of a prescribed terrorist group. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly Syrian Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are, just like those other groups, prescribed terrorist organisations. So implying they are something else, that they are heroes now and liberators, is ridiculous. And it is a sham. The BBC kept referring to the fall of Assad as a momentous day, ignoring the fact the country has now been taken over by terrorists. The rancid Kelvin McFilth, as I prefer to think of him as, the bane of the Hillsborough disaster, put out a tweet saying, "There are 30,000 Syrians in the UK who fled Assad. There's now no reason to grant them asylum. They are economic migrants, and we don't need more unskilled as we have enough of our own. Starmer must kick them out." Please feel free to join them, McFilth, although belay that, I'd sooner keep them and boot you out on your own. If you're going to talk about unskilled, you still reckon you're a journalist, sunshine. I think you're on shaky ground, quite honestly. I'd look in the mirror, quite honestly. But this is a guy using his large platform on social media to talk about deportations to a country now being run by terrorists, and he thinks it's now a safe country as a result. It's an Al-Qaeda administration now, and the media have taken leave of their senses pushing this narrative. But here is one of the worst examples of all of them that I've seen.
When I was chief of MI6 10, 12 years ago, we looked at all these Syrian opposition groups and classified them into those that we could support and those who were beyond the pale and too close to Al-Qaeda. And Tahrir al-Sham was definitely in the latter category. But I think Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the leader, has made great efforts over the last 10 years to distance himself from those terrorist groups. And certainly the actions we've seen of Tahrir al-Sham over the last 2 weeks has been those of a liberation movement, not of a terrorist organization. And so I think the Home Secretary will be asking the MI5 and the Joint Terrorism Assessment Center for a review of the situation about Tahrir al-Sham and whether it should remain on the prescribed entity list. It would be rather ridiculous, actually, if we're unable to engage with the new leadership in Syria because of a prescription dating back 12 years.
That is the former head of MI6, Sir John Sawyers, not hiding the fact Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which is a lot easier to say, were too close to Al-Qaeda to consider them being a group they could work with. They were basically Al-Qaeda. Hold the bus. A terrorist group is a terrorist group, or is it not? Surely it's one or the other. This is quite a black and white issue, or at least it should be. Distance from Al-Qaeda isn't legislated for in UK law either under the Terrorism Act. And he then sets about trying to rehabilitate the reputation of Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the HTS chief, the warlord who leads them, by saying he's reformed HTS to a point the British government could work with them, and that the actions of HTS in Syria have been of liberation movements and not of terrorists. Therefore, he thinks they should have their prescription under UK law rescinded, because otherwise, how can the UK government engage with this new administration? If you want to have a cosy political relationship with terrorists, you aren't going to be doing so in my name. And if that is the UK attitude towards proscription of certain groups, isn't it funny that this lot happen to be Israel-backed, but others opposed to Israel very much remain on that list? That's a point I'd like to revisit in another video, actually. But where Sawyers considers al-Jawlani a reformer, it might be a bit awkward that the US Embassy in Syria's Twitter account still has this image from 2017, which is a bit awkward, isn't it? A $10 million reward for al-Jawlani, the terrorist. The blurb underneath that image, which is a bit on the small side there, reads, Mohammed al-Jawlani, also known as Abu Mohammed al-Golani, also known as Mohammed al-Julani, is the senior leader of the terrorist organisation the Al-Nusra Front, ANF, Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. Under al-Jawlani's leadership, ANF has carried out multiple terrorist attacks throughout Syria, often targeting civilians. The US government is offering a reward of up to $10 million for information about al-Jawlani. Absolute confidentiality is assured and relocation may be available. If you have information, please contact the nearest US embassy or consulate. That was only 7 years ago. But who knew you could get a $10 million bounty off your head set by the US and be forgiven your track record as a head-chopping terrorist if you went to work for them or one of their allies instead? Now, instead of being on a wanted poster, he gets platformed by and gets to do cushy interviews with CNN and the like, and they don't even try to hide the fact his attire has changed to look more westernised, now dressing like Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to make him more acceptable looking, as they seek to hide his past by ignoring it or trying to gloss over it. His Wikipedia article, for example, which I dare say is going through a lot of edits at the moment, makes mention of him apparently breaking with Al-Qaeda in 2016, and his fallout with ISIL goes back to 2013, yet he was still wanted as an Al-Qaeda affiliate by the US in 2017, which is when he actually formed HTS directly out of the Al-Nusra Front. So Assad bad, the Al-Qaeda guy, well, no problem now is convenient, isn't it? So forget 9/11, forget the Manchester Arena bombing, forget everything else. He's the good guy now, so say the mainstream media. Bearing in mind the arrests of people like Sarah Wilkinson, or Richard Medhurst, or Natalie Strecker, or the raid on the home of Asa Winstanley, journalists worthy of the name, activists worthy of the name, who report the realities of what is happening in the Middle East, for calling out the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu, for doing what I'm ostensibly doing here in this video and calling out HTS and their Al-Qaeda connections. Yet their terrorism and the mainstream media can lionize that and face no police on their doorsteps at all. It really has exposed just how arbitrary and blunt a tool the UK Terrorism Act has become, when instead of being used to combat real terrorism, it is used to batter real journalists holding actual power into silence. The hypocrisy should make you want to vomit. Politicians are just as bad at this though, because of course Keir Starmer has had to weigh in on this as well, issuing a statement, and he said, "The developments in Syria in recent hours and days are unprecedented, and we are speaking to our partners in the region and monitoring the situation closely. The Syrian people have suffered under Assad's barbaric regime for too long, and we welcome his departure. Our focus is now on ensuring a political solution prevails and peace and stability are restored. We call on all sides to protect civilians and minorities and ensure essential aid can reach the most vulnerable in the coming hours and days." For one, these aren't unprecedented events. Events like this have gone on in the Middle East for decades, too often due to Western interference. Bash Assad? Check. Welcome his departure? Check. Political solution? What, with Al-Qaeda in charge of Syria now? Or are you more on the side of Netanyahu moving in and invading now instead? He was bombing Damascus overnight, after all, and has relished taking all the credit for Assad's defeat, because of course he has. This agreement with Assad being taken out, though, and ostensibly siding with these terrorists, does present Starmer and co with an old problem resurfacing in my mind, though, and that is the small matter of Shamima Begum, who of course had her citizenship stripped from her for running off to join ISIS, running off to join the group that many members of HTS came from as well, and who are now being celebrated as heroes and liberators. Should we not be welcoming Begum back to this country as a heroine now, in which case? Because that is literally what's going on here, isn't it? Begum, lest we forget, is still living in a limbo situation in a refugee camp in northern Syria, where other nations have brought their radicalised citizens back to their countries to face justice. the UK just abandoned their responsibilities to our own people, and the Starmer regime is still saying there are no plans to bring her back to the UK, leaving her to her fate at the hands of HTS. Well, perhaps she'll rejoin. Maybe she'll be more welcome here if she does that. It'll be more life for her than what she's currently living now, with her home country having failed her and abandoned her, wouldn't it? Perhaps if she joined HTS, all will be forgiven, in which case. Seems to be the attitude here, doesn't it? She was radicalised at the age of 15. She is a victim. She always was a victim and continues to be a symbol of governmental failure. She should be brought back, absolutely held accountable for her crimes, of course. But she is our responsibility and always has been. Do you know what rubs this in even more? What if the UK allows Assad to come to Britain, or more pertinently, his wife? Because for all of Starmer's attacks on Assad now, his wife Asma is a British citizen. Is she going to lose that citizenship? Is she going to be Shamima Begum? Again, the hypocrisy is off the charts. I'll be damned if I'm going to refer to the new Syrian regime as anything other than a terrorist administration, though. HTS are terrorists. Starmer might have forgotten, or conveniently so, or not known at all. But former MI6 Burks can extol desires to see that prescription overturned, but call that out and point out the double standard and the failure in leadership going on, and siding with the wrong-uns at that, well, it could mean you end up with the police on your doorstep in Starmer's Britain, and he's not alone in the West for suddenly forgiving Al-Qaeda terrorists. I spoke more in depth about how staggeringly bad for the people of Syria this takeover by HTS looks like in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do support the channel with a like, subscribe and a share as well when you're at it. It's massively appreciated. New content drops daily, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers folks.